Hello there, and welcome to the Chicken-Legged Hut. Thank you so much for joining us. They call me the Fool. Miss Yaga and the gang left me unattended, so I'm narrating this myself, I guess. This video is an odd one, mostly because I had a rough idea and just took several sharp turns in the process of making a creepy clock for the hut. It's a really great example of how our creative process works sometimes. I won't waste your time, and I'll jump right into it, but first I have a favor to ask. Please watch all the way through and comment your thoughts at the end. Now, on to the project. I got this picture frame from our junk pile, and as you can see, the backing is pretty banged up, so it's going to have to be replaced. Aside from the picture frame, the only element of this piece I was certain of was that it was going to be a clock, and it was going to be spooky because we like spooky stuff. I mainly wanted this clock to serve to show the passage of time in the background during our longer takes and bigger projects, and not so much to tell the exact time, so no numbers. We got some of these clock mechanisms. They're pretty cheap. I'm pretty sure you've seen them in every mass-produced clock at TJ Maxx or whatever. These mechanisms also came with a bunch of hands. The hands are pretty cool. One of the sets looked like tree branches, which doesn't really fit this piece, but I'd love to see them get used for something in the future. So I'm gonna go off course for a bit and just talk a little bit about the channel. My best friend, the Hermit, and I both work on these projects top to bottom. We've both been doing art for as long as we can remember, and when we were knee-high little hoodlums, we bonded over graffiti and art and also, strangely enough, weird esoteric stuff. And we've always done projects like this in our downtime. So a couple years ago, we went to an oddities expo and got inspired to make our own little oddities, and that turned into this whole idea for this YouTube channel where we were gonna make weird, spooky, witchy stuff in a witch hut with Miss Yaga and a talking taxidermy bearhead. The great thing about this was that it would allow us to do all kinds of different projects and not have to stick to doing exactly the same thing all the time. We get bored way too easily for that. Next thing you know, we're working on building the hut, and we've had a great time since then putting all these ideas together. We also shot several videos before we even released one, and a couple of those videos were just us talking about things that inspired us. We had a name for this segment, intro visuals, and everything. We didn't finish or publish those videos because our biggest critiques of our own work were our vocal delivery and tone and all the things that can be summed up as we don't like to hear ourselves talk. Now, if you want my honest opinion, I think the Hermit is just way more naturally funny than I am. If you go back and watch our videos, they're about 50-50 me or him writing the scripts, but his are mostly written off the cuff, and mine are written with a great deal of thought and effort to achieve a similar result. But both of us enjoy two things about these videos. The first is making cool stuff in the hut, and the second is writing stuff that might make someone chuckle. Normally, if one of us can get the other to laugh at a couple dumb jokes, we consider the script a success. But both of us are less comfortable writing a script as a monologue. When it's a cast of characters making deprecating jokes at our expense and pointing out our failures, that's comedy. When it's us recording alone at our desks commentating on ourselves being slow learners, then it's just kind of sad. We've gone back and forth on the idea of changing the format and just narrating all the videos ourselves, but ultimately we decided we have the most fun when the whole gang's here. My first idea was to sculpt a literal clock face with the mechanism centered in the mouth. First, I sketched out the rough proportions of the face, and next I started adding and removing clay to get the look and the details I wanted. I lost the majority of that footage, but that's okay because after putting the calipers on the best version I came up with, I realized it was going to be too thick for the clock hands to clear the raised portions of clay once I got the desired depth of the sculpture, and I ended up scrapping the idea. And before I had time to question whether my next idea was a good one, I got the equipment out. So here I am, melting wax to do probably the most ill-advised thing I've done on the channel so far. I highly recommend that you don't try to recreate this one yourself. I decided to attempt casting my fingers in the wax. When I was a kid, this was something they would set up at carnivals. There would be an ice water bath on one side and pots of wax on the other, and by repeatedly dipping your hand in wax, you would get a mold of your hand in different colors. But I only realized late in the process that I was doing it wrong, which for some could result in injury. Firstly, I'm leaving my finger in the wax way too long here. What this is doing is actually remelting the layers on my finger, which could easily result in burns from the hot wax. The only thing protecting your finger on the first dip is that your finger's a little wet prior to the plunge. Next thing I'm doing wrong is that I'm using room temperature water. The purpose of the ice water is to rapidly cool and harden the wax and further prevent it from remelting. The hard wax itself is pretty hydrophobic, so the room temperature water does its job less effectively while not doing anything to further insulate my finger. The one advantage I have, or disadvantage, is that I already don't have all of the sensation in most of my fingertips from previous injuries to my hands. At some point, you'll start to see the wax bubbling, and it's literally the water from my finger boiling out of the wax. It's very hot. So I told you what not to do. The correct method should be to soak my fingers in ice water before ever going into the wax. Then, when dipping my finger in the wax, it should have been a quick, smooth movement without hesitating or stopping, and then going back to the ice water until the next dip and repeat. But look, you can see how the water's boiling in the wax. Thankfully, rather than burning myself, I started to catch my stride at about this point. Funny thing about this is that when I started melting the wax, I don't think I had an actual end game fleshed out. Like, the finished product wasn't even a clear thing in my mind. When I do something like a sewing project, I've got to have a pattern and a material picked out and a literal step-by-step process laid out to sew the final product. The garment is in a lot of ways tangible before it's even a garment. And then by contrast, I do something like this and it's almost like divination. The materials tell me what they're going to be, and I'm just the vehicle to accomplish the task. It's kind of therapeutic, getting this opportunity to shut off the inner monologue telling myself every step, head empty, just make. So I got a bunch of these molds made up, a few more than I actually needed. I've got a bag of this unlabeled white powder which came in the mail for me. It's plaster of Paris. So I'll mix the plaster about 2 to 1 by volume with water and pour it into these molds, and I should be able to get some pretty good castings. Usually, these will be dry in about 24 hours. I left them alone for at least 48, and once they're unmolded, they will continue to cure and harden. While I should be doing other projects during this time, what I'll actually do is take a break for a couple of days and play video games while feeling bad about myself because I've accomplished nothing during my downtime. Not sure if it's healthy, but that's how my brain works. I have to stay busy, or I feel bad about enjoying myself on mindless recreation. And then I realize when I come back to it that I should have poured the wax off while it was still liquid, so I've cost myself some more time on the project. Oh well. While the wax is melting, I'm listening to my podcasts or whatever and watching it to make sure I don't burn the hut down with the hot plate. I tried removing a couple of the fingers by peeling the wax off, which did work, but it also took off some of the details. So really, what I want to do is melt the wax with a heat gun. And this just looks way better. So I'll repeat the process on the rest of the fingers. What I did after was kind of dumb on my part. I thought to prime these fingers before I painted them, but I primed them with Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear enamel. This should be a final coat. The plaster just absolutely drank the enamel, and it didn't serve well as a primer at all. So what did I do? Obviously I just jumped straight from that to painting every last finger with contrast pigments, which the plaster also drank. It's super porous. You really need a layer of thick primer or base paint. I sent some pics to the hermit and he sent me this back. And as much as I didn't want to repaint all of these again, I knew he was right, so I did exactly that. I repainted every last finger with a base coat, and then I took a mostly dry brush with contrast pigments and lightly painted over the bone white base coat with a sepia tone and a reddish brown leaving it lighter over the fingernails and darker on raised parts of the skin and redder on areas with surface damage. I gave them a thick reddish brown on the part where the finger looks cut. I don't want them to look hyper realistic, more like a good Halloween prop. I finished it by adding UV resin to the fingernails just to give it a little bit of a sheen, and I painted that resin on with a paintbrush so that it was like kind of rough and had texture. I also painted the new frame backing black, but made sure to include brush strokes and variation in thickness to make it appear worn, and I painted the frame too. I used light coats of metallic paints on the frame, rubbing some off with a paper towel to further produce the worn look. And finally, I just put everything together. I used hot glue to attach the fingers to the backing. I cut a couple of clock hands to allow them to clear the fingers, and installed the mechanism. I'll hand it over to Miss Yaga from here. Thank you for listening.
I'm back. Oh, you're already wrapping up? Well, since the fool went off on his own and did the narration, I don't have much left to say except thank you very kindly for joining us. Please consider hitting the like button. Comment your thoughts. And of course, subscribe or be cursed to frequently walk into a room only to forget why you went in there in the first place. Now without further ado, the final results.